Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In the first part of his work, Ressentiment, Max Scheler, in the course of discussing envy as a source of ressentiment, is going to make what seems to be a little bit of a digression, but is actually quite important, having to do with comparison and value. And if you know your Friedrich Nietzsche, which, of course, this work is beginning with because Nietzsche's genealogy of morals is where Scheler actually takes this conception of ressentiment from that he's going to analyze. You know that Nietzsche will make a distinction in that work and in several others between two fundamental modes of morality, or as we call it, valuations. And valuations are, you could say, ways of arranging and understanding values, Werte in German, which encompass a lot of different sorts of values. And Scheler thinks that they're in a hierarchy as well, and that's a topic for a different time. Now, Nietzsche will talk in terms of masters and slaves, or the aristocrats and the herd. Scheler prefers to use the word noble and common, and the herd are the common, and Nietzsche and Scheler both, as well as Simmel, who he's going to talk about, take this as an important distinction. So comparisons, right? Scheler is going to say, it's not as if we shouldn't ever compare ourselves against anybody else, but we do, in fact, have to be careful about the ways in which we make and rely upon comparisons. So he says the origin of ressentiment is connected with a tendency to make comparisons between others and oneself. This requires a brief examination. Each of us, noble or common, good or evil, continually compares his own value with that of others. So is it possible to have a human being who doesn't do that? Yes, it's possible, but for all practical purposes, all of us are making comparisons. So he says, if I choose a model, a hero, I am tied to such a comparison. All jealousy, all ambition, even an ideal, like the imitation of Christ, is full of such comparisons. And he says, we can't actually agree with Georg Simmel, who says that the noble man refuses to compare himself to anyone. A person, this is Scheler, who refuses any comparison is not actually noble, but an oddity in the Goethean sense, a unique buffoon, or perhaps a snob. So he disagrees with Simmel on that. If you are noble, you will make comparisons, but you're not going to make them in the same way that the common person does. If you don't make comparisons at all, you're such a weird, wacky outlier that we're not going to worry about you here. You might be free of ressentiment, but you're going to have other problems that you have to deal with. So Scheler is going to say that there are two ways to conceive a comparison. He says the two terms of a relation may be apprehended separately, prior to and independently of any comparison or other relation like similarity or identity. So we can call those as independent, where the things that are being compared already have their value in themselves, or, previous to that, then we put them together, and now we can compare them to each other. But we can also engage in comparison, he says, the perception of the terms, the things being compared, may be the actualization of a previously apprehended but still indeterminate relation. Think of this as sort of like a schema that we drop things into, and they have their value, their full meaning, not in themselves, but in relation to each other. And so people who think very schematically, generically, are going to be prone to doing this sort of thing. And he's going to talk about, he's going to do a little bit of phenomenology here, and he says that these distinctions are quite important. So the attitude that Simmel calls nobility, which is similar to, the master morality, master valuation of the people who call themselves good in the genealogy of morals by Nietzsche's, story. Scheler is going to say that this attitude is distinguished by the fact that the comparison of values, the measuring of my own value as against that of another person, is never the constitutive precondition for apprehending either. Okay, so that's a lot of technical terminology. What does he mean by that? He's going to get a bit more concrete in just a moment. But if you're noble, you're not understanding your own value primarily by relating yourself to somebody else. You understand your own value on your own terms. So he says these values, here's a second part, are apprehended in their entirety, not in certain selected aspects. The noble person has what he calls a completely naive and non-reflective awareness of his own value and his own fullness of being, an obscure conviction which enriches every conscious moment of his existence as if he were autonomously rooted in the universe. He understands, or she understands, that they belong, that they have value. They don't need to affirm that by connecting themselves to something else. They certainly can connect and compare and relate, but that's not where their value is coming from. They feel it on a, Nietzsche would say, instinctual, Scheler would probably say unconscious or not yet conscious level, which can then be brought into full consciousness. And he says, don't mistake this for pride. Pride is actually an experienced diminution, a lowering of this naive self-confidence. It's a way of holding on to one's value, seizing and preserving it deliberately. The noble man's naive self-confidence, I love this phrase, which is natural to him as tension is to the muscles, allows him to assimilate the merits of others in all the fullness of their substance and configuration. So they are not threatened by others, and they can actually admit and rejoice in others. He says that the noble person never grudges the others their merits. On the contrary, he rejoices in their virtues and feel that they make the world more worthy of love. His naive self-confidence is not compounded of a series of positive valuations based on specific qualities, talents, and virtues. It is originally directed at his very essence and being. So there's a unity to this, an essentiality to the grasp of one's own value that is possible for the noble. Now notice that this is not going to be nobility in the sociological sense, where some people belong to an aristocracy and maybe they were born into it or they clawed their way up to it. No, this is about genuine nobility of character. What can we contrast to this? Well, he's going to tell us that the common person is going to experience their own value and the value of others through relating the two. This is why they're always comparing, and the comparisons are relative, and they will be based on this aspect or that aspect. In this respect, I'm a better earner than you are. Of course, employee of the month, you get it 1 month and then you don't have your face up there on the wall anymore, and now somebody else is employee of the month and now you feel bad, right? So he goes on and he says that the common person clearly perceives only qualities which constitute possible differences between the people. The noble man experiences value prior to any comparison. The common person experiences value in and through comparison. So he goes on and says the relation is the precondition for apprehending any value. You don't apprehend the values first and then make the comparisons. You apprehend the value through making comparisons. So he says every value then becomes a relative thing, higher or lower, more or less than his own. He arrives at value judgments by comparing himself to others and others to himself. So we got two different attitudes, not just towards comparison, but two life attitudes that treat comparison differently. It's not that the noble person doesn't make comparisons, but they do make those comparisons on a different basis. Then Scheler goes on and he talks about, he's getting a little bit more refined here, how is it that people who are in this common group, how do they differ from each other in what they do with these comparisons? So he's going to contrast two different human types based on strength or weakness, power or impotence. So he talks about an energetic type of common man who becomes what he calls an Arriviste, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. We're not so concerned with him. We're more concerned with the weak common man who becomes, as he says, the person of ressentiment. This is the key topic that we're interested in. So there's a kind of impotence that he talks about, accompanying this attitude a little bit later in there. But he's already invoked power or impotence just a moment ago. So what is an Arriviste? It's somebody who comes on the scene and tries to, become the big shot. They want to control, they want to have other people look up to them. They could be motivated by the pride that he just talked about there a moment ago. He says an Arriviste is not a man who energetically and potently pursues property, honor, power, and other values. He doesn't deserve this name as long as he still thinks in the intrinsic value of something that he actively furthers and represents by profession or by calling. Instead, the Arriviste is aiming at not acquiring a thing of value, but being more highly esteemed than others. So there's a lack on their part. They fill in the lack by exerting their energy, and they need other people to like them. They need other people to say good things about them. They could even be okay with other people being afraid of them if they want power. The real test that you've got power is other people, kowtow to you because you are a dangerous person or somebody to be reckoned with, right? So he says, he uses the thing as an indifferent occasion for overcoming the oppressive feeling of inferiority, which is motivating them, which results from these constant comparisons. So they are not yet persons of ressentiment, but we can have people who actually are driven by ressentiment because they're not strong enough to do that, and that feeling of impotence, tied in with envy, leads to that dynamic. Then he's going to talk about several different situations that could play into this. And it's interesting. You notice that Scheler is rather a defender of a traditional way of organizing society, although he's not, some romantic who says, well, we got to get back to the Middle Ages, pre-modern era. But he does say this: the medieval peasant prior to the 13th century does not compare himself to the feudal lord, nor does the artisan compare himself to the knight. The peasant may make comparisons with respect to the richer and more respected peasant, and in the same way everyone confines themselves to their own sphere. Each group had its exclusive task in life, its objective unity of purpose. So these frames of reference could be compared in their totality. Such periods are dominated by the idea that everyone has his place, which is assigned to him by God and nature, and in which he has his personal duty to fulfill. in this case, in this sort of situation, which doesn't have to be just, medieval Western Europe, we could think of all sorts of other situations like this. His value consciousness and his aspirations never go beyond the sphere. And notice what he's going to say. From the king down to the hangman and the prostitute. So from the top all the way down to the bottom, everyone is noble in that they consider themselves as irreplaceable. So that's a very interesting idea. Now, perhaps this is a bit of a romanticization of pre-modern cultures. Now he's also going to talk about, and this he's taking some stuff from Marx, also from other theorists, the system of free competition that comes to be characteristic of what we call our capitalist age or modernity, late modernity in particular. And he says that if this type of value experience, the type of value experience of the lower person who is always comparing themselves, the system of free competition will become the soul of this society. It will become the way in which people understand themselves and organize themselves and activities in relation to others, carrying out comparisons by as a mode, you could say here. And he goes on and he says, listen, in the system of free competition, the notions on life's tasks and their value are not fundamental, but secondary derivations of the desire of all to surpass all the others. No place is more than a transitory point in this universal chase. Objects become commodities destined for exchange, defined by their monetary values. The progression of time is interpreted as, quote, progress, and a specific desire for progress goes with this way of thinking. And the possession or enjoyment of some unit of qualitative value that used to be the endpoint of every economic motivation is now a phenomenal unit of experience, great or small. Money as a means of exchange was a transitional goal. The final aim in this is a quantity of monetary value, and it's the quality of the commodity which becomes a mere goal, a transitional goal, right? And then he goes on and talks about, and he's going to address this a little bit later as well, phases of life that, depending on how we look at them, can lend themselves to this, and generations. So he says, there's a parallel tendency in the evaluation of the different phases of life. And what does he mean by that? Childhood, youth, maturity, old age. Not one of these phases has retained its own particular value and its peculiar significance. We're aware only of the surplus value which one phase may have as compared to the other. So it could be that we value mature people and we devalue the youth, we devalue the old people. It could be that we switch and we really only value the youth culture, right? And the others don't matter all that much. And he's got some very interesting observations here. He talks about von Ranke, this historian who rejected the childish liberal belief in historical progress in the following magnificent sentences. Such a mediated generation would have no significance of its own. It would only be important as a stepping stone towards the next generation, and it would have no direct relation to the divine. However, I affirm that every epoch is directly related to God, and its value does not lie in what it engenders, but in its very existence, its own self. So Ranke is rejecting this very comparative relational viewpoint on generations. In a way, by the way, that echoes Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard's thoughts on these sorts of things as well. So we've actually gone quite a ways in this little digression from talking about comparison itself and how it can be done in two different ways, and then talking about the noble person and the common person as being very different from each other in how they understand their own value, how they apprehend their own value, because it doesn't have to necessarily be cognitive, it could be affective as well, and how the common person, according to Scheler, tends to do this primarily in terms of, relations that have already been sort of established that we drop people into. They don't feel like they have value in themselves, but only insofar as they can be related to or compared to others, including the noble. So an important set of observations on Scheler's part in this analysis early on of how comparison figures into ressentiment and the apprehension of values.